Tina Cordova. See the website in chat. Cole, if you could put that in chat now. And then also, for those of us in Massachusetts, the film will be shown at the Salem Film Festival on March 21st. See the link for that in chat. And Cole, if you could put that into chat also. For those of you just coming in, welcome to our program, Oppenheimer, Sins of Omission, Nuclear Industry Fallout, and Indigenous and Chicano Resistance in the Southwest, sponsored by Mass Peace Action's Nuclear Disarmament and Indigenous Solidarity Groups. I'm Susan Mirsky, Chair of the Nuclear Disarmament Working Group. Here in MAPA, we address many issues, from nuclear and climate threats, widening wars, Ukraine, Gaza, to racial justice. First, a land acknowledgement from Craig Simpson, Chair of the Indigenous Solidarity Action Group. Craig.
Welcome, everyone. We've tried to make it a tradition to use a land acknowledgement in our Indigenous Solidarity webinars. But land acknowledgements are becoming routine, regimented, and hollow, with little mention of genocide and erasure. And without concrete ways, we are working against the settler colonialism we live under. We have difficulty doing this. But let's try this week's version. We are calling in from what is now called Massachusetts, but it is the land of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, Wampanoag, that's the Herring Pond, Aquinnah, Mashpee, Chappaquiddick, the Mohegan, Stockbridge, Muncie, the Nohasset, Pocatuck, Pocasset, Pawtucket, Narragansett, Pequot, Wabanaki, Abenaki, Abenaki, who have stewarded this land we called New England for hundreds of thousands of years into today, which are occupied by settler colonialism. MAPA works with many organizations and individuals to support Massachusetts' legislative agenda, prohibit Native mascots, honor Indigenous Peoples Day and Columbus Day, return Native heritage and cultural items, remains, and so-called artifacts to the tribes of origin, promote Native curriculum in public schools, change the Massachusetts flag and seal, and support land back in various forms. Let us work together and on these and other issues, and tonight and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Good evening. My name is Josna Regge. I work with Craig in the Indigenous Solidarity Action Group of MAPA. Last Sunday, as Oppenheimer swept the Academy Awards, as expected, we waited for one of the 7 Oscar winners to acknowledge the ongoing fallout from the nuclear bomb. We waited mostly in vain, with the exception of Best Actor awardee Cillian Murphy, who in closing did dedicate his Oscar to the peacemakers everywhere. I'm sure that however powerful and disturbing you might have found the film, you will be aware of at least some of its omissions. In its first-person narrative of one brilliant, troubled, not very self-aware scientist who was given a blank check by the US military to build and test an atomic bomb, the film almost completely elides the horrible deaths of nearly 300,000 Japanese civilians in 2 targeted nuclear strikes just 3 weeks after Oppenheimer's team test exploded the first nuclear device. And this was just before the end of August. In its choice to describe the sighting of the top secret project, quote, in the middle of nowhere, it erases the history of the Pajarito Plateau and the indigenous people and Chicano farmers who lived there, focusing instead on the scientists and military personnel who were gathered at what came to be named Los Alamos National Laboratories. In its focus on the anxious anticipation of that first nuclear test at the Trinity site in New Mexico, and the chance, however tiny, of setting off a nuclear chain reaction that could destroy the world, it fails to mention the slow but deadly chain reaction that it did set off, one whose fallout continues to kill people in the area nearly 80 years later. Despite the fact that uranium was essential to building the bomb, it makes no mention of the uranium mines and mills, many on tribal lands that operated for decades with an almost total lack of safety precautions for workers and residents alike, and that continue to contaminate soil, water, and people today. In a telling scene in Oppenheimer, when Robert was beating himself up over the suicide of his lover, his wife Kitty told him, "You don't get to commit the sin and then have us all feel sorry for you that it had consequences." Spot on. All too often, the perpetrators of violence are somehow made out to be the victims, deserving of our empathy. The Oppenheimers of the world are the ones who are placed front and center, fully humanized, presented as complex characters, while the people in the affected communities are nowhere to be seen. And the deaths of these shadowy figures are able to be justified in the name of a greater good. In an article entitled The Oppenheimer Film Erased, author Chantel Murphy wrote, "If the film had depicted the native New Mexicans and indigenous people who did housework in the homes of the scientists and performed janitorial services at the lab, then maybe filmgoers could have related more to the sacrifice that these Americans endured to make this weapon a reality." On the morning after the Oscars, Senator Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico, campaigning on behalf of victims of nuclear fallout, said, "Those artists deserve the wins, but what about the people whose stories were not included in that film, who are dying, who are willing to use all their energy to educate others? I certainly hope that everyone who was a part of Oppenheimer doesn't forget these folk across the country." This evening's program focuses on the people and places in the American Southwest who were not included in the film, people who are having to live and die under the long shadow of the nuclear industrial complex, which includes both the development of nuclear weapons and of commercial nuclear power, marketed under the winning slogan, "Atoms for Peace." We are graciously joined by speakers who are engaged in the struggle for their lives and lands every day on the ground, and who are willing to use their precious time and energy to educate us and engage us in this critical task as well. Susan.
All right, we are a little bit behind time, and we've got a lot we've got to do. So I'll keep this very brief. Just a few words of housekeeping. During the program, we'll keep muted. To let you know, this program is being recorded. All of the registrants will receive a follow-up email with the YouTube video resource list and links to all of the speakers and organizations. We have 4 excellent speakers. Each will have some time to present, and after each, a few minutes for Q&A for that speaker. There will be an action item, and at the end, some additional time for Q&A. Unfortunately, there's no Q&A button on the screen, so all of your questions will have to go into chat. Please, please preface your questions with the word question so we can quickly identify it. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. If you have others, you can reach out to the speakers afterwards, and their contacts will be in chat. This program will go on to 8:30. So let's get started. Craig.
Well, it's my great privilege to introduce Roberto Roybal, longtime friend of almost 40 years. We began together fighting for a great boycott and supporting the United Farm Workers and during the Vietnam War. And he's been involved in the early establishment and continued employment with Southwest Organizing Project in Albuquerque. And Roberto, why don't you just clean up all the, and he's a troublemaker from way back, so please invite him into your home. Thank you.
Unmute, Roberto.
I'm a very good troublemaker, and I like the moniker. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Craig. I'm Roberto Roybal. I'm a Chicano, born and raised in Santa Fe, and I live here now. We sit on the colonized land of the Tewa Pueblo people who call this area Oge-Poge. In 1969, I started working against the US war on Vietnam and became involved in many social justice issues. We supported the United Farm Workers in the Great Boycott. We supported the Coors Beer boycott and have worked with many organizations around social justice issues. In 1980, we founded the Southwest Organizing Project in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a community-based organization working on social, environmental, economic, and gender justice issues. I started work at SWAP in 1991 and worked there for 30 years and retired 2 years ago. Since the 1980s, we've been involved in the struggle against the US nuclear industry and the military-industrial complex, who viewed New Mexico as a nuclear sacrifice zone. In New Mexico, our struggle is opposing the full nuclear cycle impacting New Mexico. This nuclear cycle begins with uranium mining, which is extracted from indigenous lands. The atomic bomb was developed and produced in Los Alamos, New Mexico. The US dropped the first atomic bomb on New Mexico at Trinity site. The nuclear waste from the entire country is brought to New Mexico for storage at the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, or WIPP. The nuclear waste and materials are transported throughout New Mexico's highways, where we have seen many road accidents involving those trucks, including one near Los Alamos just a few months ago. And finally, the US has the largest nuclear missile storage site in the country at Kirtland Air Force Base, right next to Albuquerque. They currently have at least 3,000 nuclear missiles stored there, waiting for decommission. Whenever that'll happen, we're not holding our breaths. This nuclear cycle has greatly impacted the lives, economies, health, and safety of New Mexico residents. Today, I continue to work with Stop Forever WIPP and the Los Alamos Study Group and New Mexico Peace Fests. I also work with groups here in solidarity with the Palestinians and working for permanent ceasefire in Palestine, free Palestine. The Oppenheimer movie, which tells us about the development of the nuclear bomb in New Mexico, shamefully and callously left out the people of New Mexico, who have been severely impacted. A few of our people who have been left out from this story will speak with you this evening. And now we're going to show you a map and where our speakers are from. Our first speaker is Delavi Denepa Cook, who works in Tewa Territory in Española, New Mexico. The second speaker, Tina Cordova, works in the Tularosa Basin in southeastern New Mexico. The third speaker, Leona Morgan, works in the Navajo Reservation, New Mexico. Our fourth speaker, Lily Adams, works with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Our first speaker is Delavi Denepa Cook, Environment Justice Program Manager, Tewa Women United. She is originally from Okawinje Pueblo, Hopi, and Dene. Delavi will speak up for us up to 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions to her for another 5 minutes after that. Okay, Delavi, please continue.
Okay. Unbiak gindi nabi kawa dalavai dana pakutimu na okuewinge hera hopi hera danedimu na kaya hera kokyan hera torik oje hera nanisht ajitachini. Good evening, folks. My name is Dalavai Denapakuk, and I come from the summer clan of Okewinge Pueblo, born for the spider clan in Hopi, and my two Dene clans are saltwater and the charcoal streak of the red running into the water. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Environmental Justice Manager for Tewa Women United, and I will be presenting on how the Manhattan Project on the Pajito Plateau has contaminated the land and people before 1942 to present. The systemic and continuous omission narrative of the Manhattan Project is apparent. Similar to the other media publications about the invention of nuclear weapons in the United States, Oppenheimer mainly focuses on the personal struggles and achievements of scientists involved in the building atomic bomb. Yet it ignores the adverse effects of this development before, during, and after the Manhattan Project. There are only two sentences in the film that mention Indigenous people, one empty, Oppenheimer suggesting to President Truman that the land be returned to the Indians, and the other inaccurate and dismissive, Oppenheimer telling General Groves that the Indians gave permission for the land to be used as long as they could still bury their dead there. Non-inclusive media works like Oppenheimer obscure the realities of Pueblo people's daily experiences with nuclear construction in New Mexico. Since it was established in the heart of Tewa territory during World War II, LANL has used, or Los Alamos National Labs, has used Tewa lands and bodies as sacrifice zone. By ignoring Indigenous narratives, Oppenheimer perpetuates and reinforces a mindset that has prevailed on the Pajito Plateau for almost 80 years, that Pueblo lands and bodies are invisible and expendable. I want to talk about us as Tewa people before I get into it. So as Tewa people have lived on the Pajito Plateau since time immemorial. This is our house, our kitchen, our sleeping area, our religious space, our pharmacy, etc. Prior to all three colonizations, we followed the natural laws and lived in harmony with our Earth Mother and Sky Father. The Pueblo people here had a caring, loving, and sharing nature towards one another. We were always welcoming. We were a culturally peaceful people. It's hard to imagine not being non-violent right now. As our ancestors who lived on the Pajito Plateau left their legacy in the carvings, many of us aspire to reunify with Mother Earth and Skyfall, that we can no longer access or rely on our homelands to sustain our ways of life. We'll talk about the removal of Pueblo and Spanish homesteads. The Manhattan Project was initiated in 1939 as a result of World War II. In northern New Mexico, the 6 remaining Tewa communities, along with Cochiti and Jemez Pueblo, were designated as sacrifice zones in the state nuclear chain. The establishment of Los Alamos National Lab in the heart of Pueblo farmlands, ancestral lands, and key hunting and gathering grounds permanently impacted Pueblo lifestyles. In the years afterward, LANL reckless dumping and production practices have released lethal poisons and radiation onto the land, water, air, and wildlife. Pueblo populations experience cumulative and numerous exposures throughout the time. For communities that lived a land-based lifestyle and rely on cultural and natural resources for sustenance, repeated exposure to these toxins over generation is catastrophic. 5 years later, Hispanos from El Rancho were advised by Forest Service officials in 1943 that individuals with grazing permits south of Santa Clara Pueblo Reservation could no longer take their livestock there. The Forest Service also turned away Santa Clara Pueblo and San Ildefonso residents who sought spiritual and food on the Pajito Plateau and nearby grounds. The U.S. Secretary of War justified fencing off the territory as a 54,000-acre demolition range. We now know that this demolition range hid the Manhattan Project and Los Alamos National Labs. In the years that followed, only Manhattan Project staff and their families were allowed access to these lands, where they enthusiastically began engaging in outdoor recreation outside of their endeavors at the Manhattan Project site. Thus began the stripping of Pueblo communities and inhibited access into the Pajito Plateau and its surrounding landscape. In 1969, the Atomic Energy Commission gave the Santa Fe National Forest 26 acres of original withdrawal after the Manhattan Project was completed. Santa Clara Pueblo was denied permission to keep 7,009 acres of its Aboriginal land claim as part of the reserve. Santa Clara won an Indian Claims Commission case in 1973 to confirm its land claim. The 1940s Indian Claims Commission was created to thank Native Americans for their World War II service and to allow tribes to address their grievances against the U.S. and receive monetary compensation for territory loss due to the broken treaties. By taking the government's money, the tribe lost the right to sue again. Sometime a tribe gives up federal status to settle a claim. The federal government upheld a decision in 1975 on appeal. This victory was hollow because the Forest Service took the land after receiving a monetary award. On the Manhattan Project, the onset of global nuclear colonialism began in some of the most sacred parts of the Tewa world. Tewa villages started to shift away from the king-centric economy and sovereignty due to the loss of farmlands and hunting and gathering access. Indigenous people in the Southwest lost their economic independence, a foundation of self-determination by becoming dependent on border town commodities. The Manhattan Project launched the nuclear age with extensive effects, from the uranium extracted from Laguna and Yakima Pueblo and the Navajo Nation to the testing and assembly of bomb components in the ancestral landscapes of northern Pueblo communities to the above-ground weapons testing on our Western Shoshone relatives in Nevada and the Marshall Islands, nuclear violence and its contamination unite us and many other Indigenous peoples. The Manhattan Project assimilated people economically and culturally. Lionel weapons scientists reference Tewa religion as a tribute to them, renaming important research laboratories Kivas and Tewa Reactor romantically reflect Pueblo beliefs. Scientists built laboratories in the ruins of kivas and ancestral sites and disposed of toxic waste in unlined underground tunnels. The recruitment of Indigenous people shifted the Pueblo energy and labor from community maintenance to custodial housekeeping, etc., for the scientists flocking to the Hill because of a fundamental value shift of Tewa communities that persists today. So many of our community members carry forward stories from their relatives about what their experiences was like. I want to talk about Bayo Canyon. Open-air nuclear weapons testing began before the Trinity test in 1945 and at the Nevada test site in 1951 with the radioactive lanthanum experiments conducted in Bayo Canyon in the Espanola Basin beginning in July 24th, 1994, also known as Rolla. From then until 1964, 254 detonations are reported to have taken place as a part of the experiment. Each of the 254 tests produced a plume of dispersed radioactive lanthanum. As the Rolla testing site was situated 2 miles northeast of the city of Los Alamos, testing was scheduled four times a day when the winds blew north. The resulting clouds from the explosions were deposited as fallout, often to distances of several miles towards the northern neighboring pueblos and local Hispanic communities. In 2002, Los Alamos National Laboratory issued a warning to the Los Alamos County and the Forest Service performing thinning of trees in the area to not remove the trees cut in the various parts of the Bayo Canyon due to the possible content of residual radioactive materials. The worst affected zones are fenced off. Detectable levels of radioisotopes are present in the soil, insects, and trees in the surrounding areas. The neighboring populations was not informed about the test until the mid-1990s. And Los Alamos refused to declassify the documentation. The Rolla experience the irresponsible testing standards that expose Pueblo and Hispanic communities near and far to hundreds of instances of radioactive contamination with no warnings ever being issued. We were the first people to ever expose to radiation. Let's talk about legacy waste. The legacy of landscape scale radioactive contamination from nuclear technologies development in northern New Mexico are extensive, continuing, and are difficult to remediate. These legacies involve transgenerational justice issues, as many radioactive isotopes present in their environmental will remain deadly for hundreds or thousands of years. Lionel's main waste disposal site, Area G, is located upstream, upwind of San Ildefonso Pueblo and adjacent to White Rock. The 100-acre Pinon Juniper Woodland site contains plutonium, contaminated, highly radioactive waste from decades of nuclear research and weapon production. Given LANO's large store of highly radioactive materials and ongoing contaminant concerns, Indigenous and Hispano groups and anti-nuclear activists in New Mexico are concerned. As with other government research sites, lack of federal financing and poor data on the chemical pollutants and radioactive materials buried in pits before the 1980s have hindered cleanup. Nearing capacity, the facility had 33 large burial sites, 220 deep shafts, and 4 trenches carrying 7,200 grams of weapons-grade plutonium-239 in dry casks. Above ground, 16,000 barrels of radiation-contaminated liquid waste await shipment to the Southern New Mexico Waste Isolation Pilot Project dump site. Leaks and airborne contamination at the site exposed downstream and downwind communities, raising environmental health and justice concerns. An aquifer that San Ildefonso and other villages use for drinking and irrigation is threatened by tritium and plutonium. Long-term impacts of explosive testing and nuclear waste storage on the mountain create concerns about Pueblo safety. As with the Navajo and uranium mining, elevated rates of cancer in Pueblos adjacent to Los Alamos inevitably raise questions about cause given the near absence of cancer prior to the opening of lab. By layering radioactive waste, we extend our debt to future generations and the land.
30 seconds.
So, impact today. The Manhattan Project began a steady, ongoing disposition of Northern Pueblo people's rights. Our rights include an environment, safe environment, religious freedom, expression, economic freedom, food sovereignty, reproduction freedom, and access to sacred lands, spiritual sites. And as the labs resume plutonium pit manufacture, the second Manhattan Project is imminent and proposed to start in 2025.
Thank you so much, Dalavi. Now we have just a few minutes for questions. Let's see. We have one question here. Can you tell us a story told by any family who worked there?
I could tell, I mean, it's kind of hard because there are a lot of families that do work there, but they're not allowed to say anything. But I do know some community members who do work there. Some have had their skin, they have like their skin coming off, and they still choose to work there in the labs because we don't have much economies here in Espanola. So it's a very competitive place, and they have a lot of benefits. And so a lot of people work there. I think there was like 6%.
Okay, and one more question. Remind us, what was a project that you mentioned that's starting in 2025?
The plutonium pit expansion project.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's see, we have time for maybe one more. Explain the second Manhattan Project. No, that you did. Thank you so much. Let's see. When was the raw law, I don't know what that is, testing publicly revealed?
In the 1990s.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Dalavi. Let's go back to Roberto.
Thank you very much, Delavi. And now I'd like to invite Linda Pence Gunter of Beyond Nuclear to introduce our second speaker. Linda.
Thank you, Roberto. Wow, what an honor to introduce Tina Cordova. If you were here at the beginning and you saw the clip from First We Bombed New Mexico, you already got a sneak preview of the force of nature is sort of a cliche, but that's Tina. I first encountered Tina, actually. I think this was my first encounter. I heard that there was a hearing, of testimony before a Senate committee on the Radiation Exposure Compensation Acts on Capitol Hill. So I thought I'd go along and see what that was about. And Tina was one of the speakers. And I I sat there, I thought, wow, this is a special person, and Tina's going to be the first person to tell you that it takes a village, that it takes lots of people to make a difference. But when you've got someone who can articulate this issue the way that she can, and who has also lived it, that makes an enormous difference. And so actually, this past year, I'm part of something called the Nuclear Free Future Award, and we were able to honor Tina. Here's the program. I hope you can see it. It might be backwards, but from the Nuclear Free Future Award, which I know, Susan, you were at in New York, and the only thing so we asked ourselves when we gave Tina this award was what took us so long, because she's been doing this for almost 2 decades, as well as running a full-time business, so this is not sort of, something that she can concentrate on all her time. But I think what struck me most about Tina is that, yes, you're right, Tina, it does take all of us to push this enormous boulder up the hill. And it's wonderful. I get a chance to talk about this some of the time, and it's wonderful to be an ally. It's a privilege to be an ally. But there is nothing like hearing it from, and you're going to hear from, you've already heard the story from the people who live it. There's nothing like hearing the experience from the people who live it. So I'm so appreciative to all of you today who organized this, who have given voice to the people who've actually lived this experience. Because those are the stories that we don't hear nearly enough from the people who've gone through this. And there's nobody I've come across who can tell this story quite like Tina can, with not only passion and emotion, but enormous amount of integrity, reality. What she's been able to do actually so far with the radiation exposure compensation, that's been phenomenal. And I just hope that the House takes this up. The Senate's passed it as a standalone. Let's hope that the House does the same thing, because it's high time that the Trinity downwinders, can you believe that the Trinity downwinders were never considered affected by the atomic testing? I mean, we're never included in RECA. So bravo, Tina. And I'm going to go right to you because you tell this story better than anyone.
Well, thank you, Linda, and thank you so much to Massachusetts Peace Action for including me this evening. Good evening, everyone. I love what Linda said about the lived experience, because one of the things that I've been saying recently is that at a film festival in Santa Barbara, California, I was present in the room when Cillian Murphy gave Robert Downey Jr. this amazing recognition and award. And I sat there sort of in a rage thinking to myself, these people are receiving all these awards for playing the parts in history when we were the people that lived the parts in this history and we received no recognition. And so I'm here tonight because I take advantage of every opportunity that's given to me to educate people about what happened to those of us who lived as close as 12 miles to the Trinity test site. And so there's a few things that I want to cover. I first want to cover some very specific things about the test at Trinity that made it so dangerous to us. And then I'm going to talk about where we're at today. I'll speak a little bit about Oppenheimer, and then I'll talk about where we're at today with the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which is our ultimate goal. So just very quickly, it was the first test. A lot of people think that the government didn't know what they were doing, but that is absolutely not true. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were creating a bomb of mass destruction. They already knew that radiation was dangerous to human health. And they knew that the test at Trinity was going to produce massive fallout because they did a test run of the bomb in May of 1945. It's called the 100-ton test. And most people don't know about that. It was conventional explosives laced with radiation, and then they tracked the radiation to see where it would go, and it went far and wide around New Mexico. So they knew. The other thing about Trinity that is really unique to that test itself is that it was incredibly inefficient. They packed the bomb with 13 pounds of weapons-grade plutonium. Only 3 pounds were necessary for the fission process, so a full 10 pounds of plutonium went up in the fireball that ascended about 60,000 feet past the atmosphere into the stratosphere. That plutonium, of course, then rained down as part of the radioactive ash that fell for days on our communities. And we know now, because of the study that was done by Sebastian Philippe from Princeton University, that the fallout went all over New Mexico, although our government has told us for many, many years that it went off in this orderly fashion over only the northeastern part of New Mexico, the most unpopulated part of our state, and that very few people were harmed. We know now that the fallout went all over New Mexico and to 46 other states, along with Canada and Mexico. So the radioactive ash fell for days afterwards. It was the only time a bomb was ever detonated on a platform 100 feet off the ground. In comparison, that type of a bomb produces massive fallout, very little destruction. In comparison, the bombs in Japan were detonated at 1,600 and 1,800 feet, and those bombs were detonated that way to produce mass destruction. The other thing to know about Trinity is that in 1945, in those villages, most of the towns surrounding Trinity, we had no running water. It was our rainy season. And now this ash fell from the sky and became part of our complete water source. We collected the rainwater in cisterns. Those were closed, contained spaces, some of them underground, some of them above ground. But once the radioactive material was part of those systems, it was there forevermore. Our creeks, our rivers, our lakes, our ditches would have been filling up with water in July during our rainy season. So now our complete water source is affected. We also had no electricity, so we had no grocery stores. We had mercantile stores, and you could buy things like sugar, flour, coffee, rice, cereal. You couldn't, though, buy dairy, you couldn't buy produce, and you couldn't buy meat. So all of those things were produced by us, by our own means, at our own homes. We had active dairies in all the little towns. We also raised chickens and pigs and sheep and goats, and we hunted, and we had gardens and orchards. And so we were very much overexposed to radiation. We were inhaling it as the ash fell from the sky. We were absorbing it on our skin because we couldn't bathe as often. So if we got it on our scalp or on our skin after Trinity, it remained there until we were able to bathe again. And then we were ingesting it through our water and through our food. So we were maximally exposed. It was sort of a perfect storm. The government came here, they invaded our lands and our lives, destroyed our environment. They never warned us before or afterwards. One of the most horrifying parts of this history for me is that in the months directly after Trinity, we had a spike in infant mortality in New Mexico. We went from losing something like 30 babies per thousand to losing over 100 babies per thousand. And we think that number's very understated because most babies were born at home and their births were sometimes not recorded. So obviously their deaths would not have been recorded. And we're collecting that data, and we just recently applied for a grant so we could evaluate it a little bit better. So what happened to people? We were horribly overexposed to radiation. A good example would have been my 4-year-old father living 45 miles from the Trinity site, drinking water that was contaminated, eating fruits and vegetables and meat that was contaminated, and drinking mass quantities of cow's milk that was contaminated. My father was the 3rd generation in his family to have cancer since 1945. Both my great-grandfathers alive at the time of the test developed cancer. Both my grandmothers had cancer. My father died 11 years ago from cancer. He developed cancer at the base of his tongue, and then he got prostate cancer, and then he developed another primary oral tumor at the front of his tongue. My father didn't drink much alcohol, didn't smoke cigarettes, never used chewing tobacco, and had no viruses. And when I ask the doctors here, how does this happen? They say it doesn't, but we see it all the time in New Mexico. I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer when I was 39 years old, and the first thing they asked me was, when were you exposed to radiation? Did you work in a lab with radioactive isotopes? Have you had a lot of x-rays? Did you work in an x-ray facility? And I said no, no, and no. But I grew up in a community 45 miles away the crows fly from Trinity, and likely we were exposed to radiation, and I have the genetics for it. And now what's really terrible is that I have a 24-year-old niece who was diagnosed at the age of 23 with thyroid cancer. She's had her life upended, she's had complications, and she'll never be the same. She's the 5th generation in my family to have cancer. Now, I wish I could say my family is unique, but we're not. We've documented hundreds of families just like mine that are displaying 4 and 5 generations of cancer. We have been fighting in Congress for 14 years now to amend what's called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act to include the people of New Mexico, the first people exposed to radiation any place in the world. And the government has resisted that. And they're no longer arguing that they harmed us. They're simply saying that it's going to cost too much to add us to RECA. And we know that that's not true. We know that we spend around $50 billion annually just maintaining our nuclear arsenal, not adding to it, not building a new pit, doing nothing other than maintaining it. And RECA so far has cost $2.6 billion in 34 years. Currently, the bill that was passed in the US Senate last week has a budget assigned to it of about $50 billion. It would add a number of other states for the first time, like Idaho and Montana and Colorado. It would also include all of Arizona, Utah, and Nevada, and it would add Guam. And we'd also be adding the post-71 uranium workers who've never been covered. So everybody has a role to play. I'm asking everybody to reach out to members of Congress, especially Republican members of the House, and let them know that this is of vital importance to you. I continue to say that once you know this history, if you remain complacent, then you're complicit in what has taken place as a result of that first atomic bomb. The other thing I wanted to talk about just very quickly is that when they came here to film the Oppenheimer movie, they invaded our lands and our lives. They took advantage of our incredible scenery. They won an award for cinematography. They actually have never, ever acknowledged New Mexico as they've received all these awards. They've never acknowledged New Mexico and the part we played in the Manhattan Project. We did all the heavy lifting. We built the roads, the bridges, the facilities, and then we became the janitors. We were the women that were bussed up to Los Alamos. We cooked every meal. We cleaned every house. We changed every diaper. We fed every bottle. None of that has ever been recognized. And the fact that we live 12 miles away from the Trinity test site and we've never been recognized, as far as I'm concerned, is unacceptable. They will gross over $1 billion on this movie. And New Mexico happens to be a very poor state. 47% of all the people in New Mexico access healthcare using Medicaid, the highest in the nation. We recently also found out that New Mexicans are carrying some of the highest medical debt in the country. We have a little over 2 million people living in New Mexico, and we're carrying 881 million, almost $1 billion in medical debt. That is not a sustainable equation. And we know that this is tied to being a downwinder because we've been collecting health surveys for over 17 years now, and we ask the question about how do you access healthcare, and people inevitably mark Medicaid or Medicare. And what we know is a story that goes something like this. I had a really good job. I had health insurance. I had a retirement. My wife and I were looking forward to retirement. We were going to travel, but there's no doctor where I live, and I always had an ache in my belly. My wife finally made me an appointment to see a doctor 80 miles away. We went, they ran some tests. They told me I have stage 3 colon cancer. Now I have to drive to El Paso every day for chemo except on the weekend. And I did that for a while and kept my job, but it wasn't something that I could keep up with. And I landed up having to quit. I lost my health insurance. I've spent all my retirement. I've taken out all the equity in my home, and I've maxed out 3 credit cards. My kids send me Visa cards so that I can buy gas to get back and forth to El Paso. And most days I wish I would die so I wouldn't be a burden. We don't ever have an opportunity to develop generational wealth. All we do is pass on debt to our family. And that is one of the reasons that our state has suffered so much. I always tell people there's the physiological effects and the negative health effects that we've suffered, but there are also associated with that emotional, psychological, and financial effects. And so I just want to say that shame on the movie makers. They could have added a panel at the end of that film and acknowledged the sacrifice and the suffering of the people of New Mexico. But they chose not to, even though we have reached out to them at every step of the way. They have chosen not to do that, and shame on them. It's something that I believe is just absolutely unforgivable. They had an opportunity to do something fantastic for mankind by starting a dialogue about disarmament, or at the very least about what's happened here in New Mexico. And with that, I will end and ask if there are any questions. I'll be glad to answer them.
So, Tina, I did not stop you at 10 minutes. First of all, because there were no questions at that point, and also because what you are saying and how you are saying it, your voice is so important that I think people were just listening to you. So somebody did ask, how can we support you? And we did put in the chat that resources will be put in the follow-up email. Also, Tina, and also for Dalavai, if you want to put your contact information in the chat right now so people can get in touch with you, but to know that that will come later in that follow-up email. So thank you very, very much. And maybe by the end, we will have a few minutes at the very end of our program for some Q&A. So if you were riveted, but can think of another question, please put it in the chat and we'll know to listen to it. Thank you so much, Tina.
Absolutely.
And now we go to Roberto.
Okay, thank you very much, Tina, again. Our third speaker is Leona Morgan, the Dene woman, who has been an anti-nuclear agitator since 2007. Leona is a co-founder of Hall No, a volunteer Indigenous-led group collaborating with Indigenous communities and leaders, environmental organizations, and community-based advocates working to stop nuclear colonialism in the Southwest. She is a graduate student at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Leona will speak for 10 minutes and then we'll open up for questions to her for another 5 minutes. Leona, it's all yours.
Thank you, Roberto. I'm very happy to be introduced by you. I know you did a lot of work going all the way back to the WHIP days and then in the 80s and then the Mount Taylor Coalition. And I think right now we do need some discussion on action steps moving forward. How do we all work together? How, coming out of this webinar. Let me just back up a little bit and then I'm going to introduce myself and then get into my presentation. So I'll just start by introducing myself to my relatives and basically I'm going to just say my clans and let folks know who I am. I'm living right now in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I'm going to talk about a little bit of everything, maybe, I don't know, mostly focusing on uranium mining and then different things happening in the world today regarding nuclear energy, nuclear weapons. So I got a little handy dandy little presentation for you all. First of all, I just wanted to for folks who don't know who I am or, some of the basics of the nuclear fuel chain, starting with the uranium mining and what we call the front end. I'm going to just go over that a little bit. And I think, earlier we've heard a lot from Dalavai and Tina about nuclear colonialism. So I'm not going to really talk too much about that. I mean, ultimately, nuclear colonialism is the ongoing colonization and theft of our land, contamination, and as a colleague of mine called it, a slow genocide of our people, which is funded by the United States government. So some of my work, this is an image that we created for a project to educate our community folks about the impacts of uranium mining. I was working with a group called INDOM, Eastern Navajo Dene Against Uranium Mining, and we were fighting a new uranium mine on the Navajo Nation. Well, it's adjacent to the nation in the checkerboard area. It's very complicated, but essentially the people don't really care about the companies, the projects, the permits, the NEPA calendar. This is all irrelevant to Dine people living on the land who were there before these things existed. And so a lot of people were asking me, what are the impacts to us? What's going to happen to us? So we developed some artwork and some educational materials. This is one of them. So through my work over the last 15 years, I worked with Eastern Navajo Dine against uranium mining. I spent 10 years as the Indigenous coordinator. These are all volunteer positions. The volunteer coordinator for the Indigenous Caucus of the Western Mining Action Network. And then later I developed my own projects, Dine No Nukes, Radiation Monitoring Project, Nuclear Issues Study Group, which no longer exists. And then now the big focus is Hall No. So I'm going to get into Hall No's work, which is kind of the main urgent issue of the day. Before I get to that, that's a new uranium mine that just started at the Grand Canyon this year. And so how did we get to that? How did we get to uranium mining? Basically, this is a longer discussion and longer presentation that could take an hour alone on this, on this slide alone. The main points is this was the entire nuclear industry, everything going into weapons and now energy, it's all by design. And it's all, like Tina was saying, these things were premeditated. Someone said it earlier in the webinar, and even going all the way back to the doctrine of discovery, which was this, document coming out of Europe saying we are less than human, and so therefore it's okay to, remove us, which is a nice euphemism for genocide. So remove us from the land, colonize our land, take ownership of our land. So this was all a process of white settler colonialism within the North America, Turtle Island, South America, other countries in the world, other places. And moving forward in the United States, we have this thing called the Mining Law of 1872, which was also there's a form of it in Canada. So this is another part of the process of nuclear colonialism that legalized the theft of our land through mining. So this was mining of various hard rock minerals, including gold, silver, copper. So folks might have heard of the fight at Oak Flat in Arizona. Same challenge. And so for us, we're dealing with this 1872 mining law, but we're also dealing with impacts from the 1868 treaty, which apparently our leaders back then, signing documents in English, somehow signed away all of our future rights or right-of-ways through our land for all future utilities. So this is some of the language that is preventing us from protecting ourselves today. So, I'm going to get into that in a minute. That's just some of the background, some of the history with the issue. And so going into the history some more, I'm going to go over what is uranium used for mostly. I'm going to go over the mostly the energy side of what uranium is used for, but I just want to highlight the abandoned uranium mines in the country. These were predominantly, I think, I would say mostly like all for weapons. So this was before nuclear energy development. This was before the EPA. So before there were laws in place to remediate, to clean up, to monitor, basically any kind of environmental protections. So all of the mining, the boom that happened from, the mid 40s to the late 70s, early 80s, a lot of that mining was before these regulations, leaving 20,000 abandoned uranium mines across the country. This is a really cool map. I'll put the link in the chat. It's an interactive map. You can zoom in and look at individual mines. So just to orient people to where we are, we got this little map here of the Navajo Nation, and we're in the Four Corners region, or the southwest of the so-called United States. And then here is a US EPA map again, the abandoned uranium mines. And you can see how kind of sanitized it is. Right here, I just want to point out Cameron, Arizona has 111 abandoned uranium mines out of 524 that are being cleaned up. They're not really being cleaned up. They're just kind of bearing the waste. So this is just on the Navajo Nation where some cleanup is happening. The rest of the country, there's no law for cleanup. There's no funding. This is a map from Southwest Research and Information Center in Albuquerque. So this one shows, a lot more information than this this other EPA map. This other EPA map doesn't give a lot of the contamination or show much. Whereas this one, I want to highlight the blue squares are uranium mills that have closed. So the mills are where they process the ore. So all of these are conventional mines. They're not ISL. They're all conventional, meaning they took rock out of the earth, however they did, and then trucked it to a mill. And at the mill is where they processed it using a lot of water, chemical solution, and all of that created a lot more waste. So this is Church Rock. This is where the world's largest uranium spill occurred and the largest release of radiation in the United States on July 16th. That's the same day of the Trinity test, but the Trinity test was in 45 and the Church Rock spill was in 1979. And nobody, like a lot of people don't know about this spill, even though it was just a couple months after 3 Mile Island. So yeah, we want folks to remember the Church Rock spill, remember Trinity. And so real quickly, right now we're experiencing this surge or push for new uranium. The price of uranium went over $100 a pound this year, and it hasn't done that since, for like 15 years, since like 2007. And I know I'm getting really close to my time. If I could just have a couple more minutes. So right now, we're dealing with a push for new uranium mining because President Biden and the United States and 21 other countries committed to triple nuclear energy development by 2050. For climate. And this is what they're saying is that this is going to save us from the climate disaster. But the reason why people think nuclear is going to help, and it's not, it's a false solution. And this is why, is because they only count the carbon footprint at the nuclear reactor, the nuclear power plant. They don't count the carbon footprint of all of the front end processes, all of the transportation, and of course, all of the waste, which needs to be managed, needs to be cleaned up and managed in different ways, especially the waste from power plants, which will be very radioactive for a very, very long time. They just conveniently do not count the carbon footprint of that. So we were dealing with that in New Mexico and Texas. That's called high-level radioactive waste, or CIS, consolidated interim storage. So that's why nuclear is a false solution to climate change. And this here, Hall No, is the campaign, the initiative that I work with right now. We started it in 2016 because we knew that there were efforts to protect the Grand Canyon from new uranium mining, but we knew even back then there was this loophole that didn't include this one mine called Canyon Mine. So because the price of uranium went up, because Biden is pushing for more nuclear, and then because, Congress just passed the Nuclear Fuel Security Act, thankfully it doesn't have a budget, but this is, the direction they're going is more uranium mining. So we're seeing the impact firsthand at the Grand Canyon. That has been, this mine has been fought by the Havasupai since it was proposed back in the 80s. It was licensed in 1986, and it just started on January 8th. Hall No has been monitoring it over the years, and we've caught them contaminating the Forest Service lands. They were hauling uranium water in unmarked trucks. This is from this year. You can see the tractor turned over. And these are the pictures of the first new piles of uranium. So we were on the ground watching them, and this is how we notified the Navajo Nation, we notified everyone we could. Then the Forest Service did their notifications. But this is what we're fighting. And basically, there was this national monument created around the Grand Canyon, almost 1 million acres to stop all these claims. These are claims created from the 1872 mining law. And so because of that 1872 mining law, Pinyon Plain, it was called Canyon Mine. We still call it Canyon Mine. It was basically grandfathered in and allowed, even though this new national monument that Biden signed on August 8th, 2023, it was supposed to stop all new mining in the national monument forever, except for the ones that have this special grandfathered in status through what's called valid existing rights. So just real quickly, we're fighting the transport of the mine, obviously in our name, a Hall No, So the mine is located just a few miles, about, I think it's 14 miles south of the Grand Canyon from the Colorado River. And their plan is to transport the ore down to I-40 through the city of Flagstaff. And then the majority of the 300-mile route is on Navajo Nation, which has a law against uranium mining. And we also have a law against transport. The very first community it will hit is Cameron, which is, the most impacted with 111 abandoned uranium mines. So because the uranium is less than 1% uranium, they don't have to mark the trucks with radioactive placards. We don't know when they're going to transport, but according to our monitoring, it's very soon. They announced this month or next month. So we're just hoping the price of uranium keeps going down. I'll put some more information in the chat. We're asking folks to talk to the governor of Arizona, President Biden, different things like that. And yeah, so that is it. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Leona. We have time for maybe one quick question. We have a few very good questions, and I'm looking in chat. Please discuss consequences of the Trinity Project sites, including mines and their successors on Rio Grande drainage. Whoa.
I think that's a question for Tina, but I just wanted to add that the reason why this fight is so important is because right now, like I said, the Navajo Nation has a law against transport and we have a law against uranium mining, but the mine is off of Navajo Nation and the roads that go through our reservation are all US highways. So we need everybody's help to try to stop this because it's a bigger issue. We're to stop the transport, we're working to shut down the mine. And I think this would be a good way to kind of stop a new wave or a new uranium boom if that's what Biden is pushing.
Okay, and someone said, how can non-Southwesterners get involved and offer support? And that will be the resources that we put in the follow-up email that's going to go to all of the registrants. So Leona, if you could put that in or include that, and we will send that out. All right, thank you so much, Leona. Let's go to Roberto.
Okay, thanks again, Leona. Okay, our fourth speaker is Lily Adams, who works at the Union of Concerned Scientists and is a co-founder of Nuclear Voices, which seeks to amplify nuclear frontline communities and issues of nuclear justice, and she serves as a member of the board of directors at the Arms Control Association. Lily will speak for 5 minutes and take questions for another 2 minutes. Lily.
Thanks so much, Roberto. And I'll speak for a little less time so we can return to Dalavi and have her finish her talk as well. That's easy to do because Tina Cordova already shared some excellent information about the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which is what I'm here to talk about. So Tina is making my job very easy. So I'll quickly share a couple of things just very briefly, and then turn it back. So, and can folks see my slides?
Yes.
Great. I show this sort of chart just to point out that there are a number of different compensation programs in the US for people exposed to radiation from nuclear weapons activities. And while these programs are all valuable in their own ways, they're also all incredibly flawed, and they also all function differently, function in different agencies, have different rules and regulations around them. So it makes for an incredibly complicated process for people who need this help to actually get it. And as I'll just say quickly later, they also leave out a lot of people. So even though, it's good that the programs exist, there are many, many flaws. And as Tina said, many folks have been working for decades to try and improve them. And one of those is RECA, or the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. And it only covers a small number of downwinders in 22 counties, and covers some uranium workers, but not those who worked after 1971, covers some atomic veterans exposed to radiation during their service, but not all. It provides a small amount of compensation. Unlike some of the other programs listed here, RECA does not provide any medical benefits, so it's a pretty limited program. It just provides the one-time compensation and makes some cancer screenings available. And interestingly, it's the only program that offers a congressional apology. And then it is also a good piece of the program that we have worked very hard to maintain is that it is presumptive. So you don't have to prove an exact dose or exactly how you were exposed. You just have to have lived in one of the areas that's covered and have one of the compensable illnesses, which is so important because we know that the government did a terrible job, as Tina talked about, in tracking people's exposure and sort of ignored that. So it is truly impossible for people to prove, and that burden can't be put on communities. So just to get a sense of the scope, this is the downwind covered area right now. But this is the map of fallout that Tina referenced before that just came out last year. And I think what's jarring is that even the orange areas are high levels of exposure. So you can see how far fallout spread versus the very small covered area. So as Tina talked about, there's a bill that passed in the Senate last week that would make some important improvements to RECA. It doesn't make all of the improvements that we would like to see. So for example, it doesn't include medical benefits, which is something communities have been fighting for, but it does at least expand the downwind area. It adds some illnesses. It extends that uranium worker eligibility. For the first time ever, includes some communities that were exposed from nuclear waste, but not all, and slightly increases the compensation amount. And it was pretty remarkable that this passed in the Senate 69-30, with even some surprising folks like Mitch McConnell voting in favor. I think it does show how much of this is just such a human issue that it has been able to build that kind of support. So this is a really exciting development, but obviously the work's not done. So at the end, I think maybe we can wait until after Dalavi's presentation, but there's an action that folks can take to call Speaker Johnson. He's really the deciding vote. He's not been very helpful on this issue in the past and has even worked to take this to oppose this legislation. So we are asking everyone to call his office, and we'll put the link in the chat. And there are, I think, 150 people on the call. So if everyone who's here made a call, it would actually make a huge difference, because it would be very noticeable to Speaker Johnson's office to suddenly have 150 voicemails in the morning on RECA. So that's all I have for now. And I'd love to turn it back to Dalavi and then answer any questions at the end if there are any.
Well, Lily, I'm just going to switch things around and ask that be put in the chat right now, and we take 1 minute to make those telephone calls, because you're talking about that right now, and then we'll get back to
Sure. Okay, let me grab the link then.
Instead of Q&A, we'll have Dalavai do the rest of her.
Okay, great. Let me just grab the link for folks then. Or if I think I've sent it before, so someone else has it handy, please go ahead and throw it in. Or
Cole, I think you've got it.
I also have it. Let's see. I have it
I got
now.
it somewhere. Let's see what I can find.
So that's the link right there.
So get your phones ready.
And the way that it'll work is if you click the link and put in your information, it will basically you'll get a call on your phone. And when you answer that, it will connect you directly to Speaker Johnson's office. And you'll also receive some talking points that you can just basically read off of.
Okay, so that's going to be in the chat. And if you don't have a chance to do it right now, or you don't have a proper kind of phone, not proper, an improper phone, then please do this later. We'll give that information and that link to this call-in petition in the follow-up email. So let's see, are we seeing that? Here it is. So take a look, and if you can, anybody do that call right now. And while you're doing that call, let's go to Dalavai. And I'm not seeing anything more in the chat in terms of questions. So also, please, all the presenters, put your information into chat so that if you've had questions, you can get in touch with the speakers. Dalavai.
Yeah, sorry, it won't take me too long. I just really want to emphasize these areas. So I want to talk about our culture, our community impacts today. Talking about continuing exposed to radiation. We are still facing it today. I wanted to show these images as this was like an art exhibit at the CCA in Santa Fe. This was on the left who were a part of the LANL and were taking pictures of objects that were like very important to them. And then on the right side, you'll see LANL workers that have objects in the images that are important to them. So you can see they're very different. And it just shows you what the importance is or what their priorities were in that time. And then on the bottom of the screen, we are still dealing with people recruiting Indigenous people, and specifically in my Pueblo Okewinge, they are partnering with this organization called Pueblo Alliance, and it's to give an equal opportunity employee to go work at LANL to clean up the waste. I do know these people who do work for Pueblo Alliance, and they don't believe that they're being impacted by radiation at all. So that just kind of gives you like some insight of people, the information that are getting fed at Los Alamos National Lab. I want to go over this last, one of these last slides. So Table Women United, this is our Navajo our land working mother model addresses the dose calculation and inequities of the reference man model. It's a set of physical and lifestyle attributes based on the average Manhattan Project worker that determines the safe levels of worker exposure, cleanup standards, and environmental releases. Reference man in radiation dose calculations discriminates against communities of color, drastically underestimates exposure to children and women. Indigenous families are at constant and complicated risk in nuclear weapons producing sites, especially considering studies that show low-level ionizing radiation exposure cause as much damage as high-level exposure. Rapidly dividing cells are more likely to be damaged, such as being progressed or died before repairing themselves, putting developing fetuses and growing children at risk of defects, damage, or death from any level of exposure, as well as damage to the digestive, bone, and immune systems of all humans at all ages. So our Table Women United's, our Navajo illustrates the lifestyle and living conditions that radiation exposure guidelines should protect, which is a pregnant woman and her baby who live on the land, farm, and get all their needs from their environment. We, as Table Women United, we are opposed to the weaponization of language related to birth and gender as terms referring to war and weapons development. The nuclear industry in New Mexico uses violent patriarchy to glorify the role in birthing the atomic bomb, like the birthing little boy, and New Mexico as the birthplace of the atomic bomb are just two examples, while Indigenous people and birth workers are reclaiming birth as a matriarchal ceremony and addressing radioactive exposure's widespread reproductive effects in Pueblo communities. All in all, we strive for a culture of peace, for essential environmental justice and protection. This is just a recap of all the different toxins that were get exposed. So at the beginning, during the Manhattan Project, we were exposed to uranium, plutonium, and then later on, we were exposed to lead, the Rolla experiments, beryllium, and then now we're kind of facing the tritium, the hexavalent chromium, plume, copper. These are just some of the toxins that were getting exposed. There's a way bigger list than this. And then that's it. So that's all I want to share. So thank you.
Wow. Delavi, thank you so much. And I'm glad we had a chance to see that and hear from you in that last part. You had wonderful things to say for all of us. You know, I see that there are some questions that have come through on chat. So please, for the presenters, take a look at those and the information of the presenters, I think, is in chat, and then also will be in a follow-up email. That said, I think it's time for us to say thank you. Roberto?
Okay, thank you very much. And we're going to hand this over now to Josna Reggae.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Roberto. Thank you to all of our speakers tonight. It was just an honor to have you here and a privilege. And I know I'll be thinking about this and following up with all your resources for quite some time to come. So we'll be in touch too to make sure that the resources we're sending out to everyone are the ones you want us to highlight. So thanks again, everyone. And I'll pass on to Craig.
Yeah, thank you for everyone coming, and look forward to more webinars, especially around nuclear waste in the spring. We want to present more in-depth webinars and educational formats to talk about nuclear waste. So please join that. And Susan, are you
Right.
next?
Yeah, so I just want to say thank you, but please remember to save your chat. And I would like everybody to go to gallery view. So we want to see everybody who's still here. Please put on your video and unmute. So let's see everybody. All right. Wonderful. And now unmute. Everybody unmute. And we can all say thank you to our speakers, our presenters.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming, everyone. We'll be in touch. You stay in touch, please.